Lonely widow helps homeless man, discovers he's her long-lost brother. Margaret Ryan had read those words in the local newspaper countless times over the past week, fingers tracing the headline as if touching a wound that wouldn't heal. She'd clipped the article about someone else's miraculous reunion, folded it neatly inside her journal, and carried it like a talisman. A reminder that sometimes, just sometimes, the world still held magic for people like her. But not for her. Never for her. The autumn wind rattled her kitchen window as Margaret stared at the empty chair across from hers. 5 years since Richard's passing, and she still set 2 mugs on the breakfast table each morning. Old habits, a widow's rituals. The steam from her tea curled upward, disappearing like so many of her dreams. Outside, maple leaves painted her yard in strokes of amber and crimson. 62 years old, and fall had always been her favorite season, until it became a reminder of everything she'd lost. Richard died in October. Her only daughter Claire moved to Australia 3 years ago. And her brother? Margaret closed her eyes, refusing to complete the thought. 37 years was long enough to know some wounds never truly heal. They just become part of you, like breathing. The doorbell chimed, startling her from her reverie. Probably Mrs. Abernathy from next door, checking in as she did every Thursday with baked goods and gossip, both equally stale. "Coming," Margaret called, smoothing her cardigan and tucking a strand of silver-streaked brown hair behind her ear. But it wasn't Mrs. Abernathy on her porch. It was Pastor Bill from First Methodist, his kind face pinched with concern, a young volunteer from the church's outreach program hovering awkwardly behind him. "Margaret, good morning. Sorry to drop by unannounced." "Pastor Bill, is everything all right?" Her hand instinctively clutched the doorframe. "Well, we have a situation at the church. The shelter's at capacity with the early cold snap, and we have a gentleman," he gestured vaguely. "He's been coming to our soup kitchen for a few weeks. Quiet, no trouble, but he needs somewhere to stay temporarily, just until the county housing assistance comes through." Margaret felt herself stiffen. "And you're asking me?" Pastor Bill's smile was gentle but determined. "You have that guest room you mentioned donating bedding from last spring, and you're one of the few congregation members with no family to object." She finished for him, the words bitter on her tongue. "I was going to say with a heart as big as yours," he corrected softly. Margaret glanced past him to the church van parked at the curb. Through the window, she could make out a hunched figure in the back seat. "I don't know, Pastor. I've never—" "Just for 2 weeks, Margaret. He's not young, not dangerous. Just down on his luck?" Pastor Bill lowered his voice. "He's actually quite educated. Used to be a teacher, I believe, before. Well, life happens to the best of us, doesn't it? The universe has a peculiar way of answering prayers we never knew we'd made." Later, Margaret would wonder if some part of her had been waiting for this moment all along, if loneliness had hollowed her out precisely to make room for what was to come. 2 weeks, she finally said, the words falling from her lips before she fully decided. "But I want to meet him first." Pastor Bill's face brightened. "Of course. Jenny, would you ask Mr. Sullivan to come up, please?" The young volunteer hurried to the van. Margaret watched, heart inexplicably racing, as she opened the door and spoke to the figure inside. A tall man emerged slowly, as if each movement required calculation. His clothes were clean but worn, clearly donated church items. A navy canvas jacket hung from broad but stooped shoulders. His gray-streaked beard couldn't hide gaunt cheeks. But it was his hesitation that struck Margaret most, the careful way he approached, eyes downcast, like a man who'd learned the world was quickest to strike those who looked directly at it. "Margaret Ryan, this is James Sullivan," Pastor Bill said. The man lifted his gaze then, and Margaret felt the October air suddenly turn December cold around her. Blue eyes, startlingly blue like cornflowers, like her father's eyes, like her own. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a rough whisper. "I appreciate your kindness, but I don't want to impose." Something flickered in Margaret's chest. Recognition without understanding, like catching a familiar scent you can't quite place. She found herself stepping back, widening the doorway. "It's no imposition," she heard herself say. "Please come in out of the cold." As he stepped over her threshold, Margaret felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the autumn chill. 2 weeks, she reminded herself. 2 weeks of charity, and then her quiet life would resume. The universe, in its infinite wisdom and terrible mercy, said nothing to correct her. James Sullivan moved through her house like a ghost. Margaret had shown him to the small guest room that afternoon, after Pastor Bill left with promises to check in regularly. The room had stood empty since Claire moved out 15 years ago, save for holiday visits that grew increasingly rare after Richard died. Bathrooms across the hall, she'd explained, watching him set a small duffel bag, containing what appeared to be everything he owned, carefully on the perfectly made bed. Towels in the linen closet? Help yourself to anything in the kitchen, though I usually eat dinner around 6. He'd nodded, those unsettling blue eyes never quite meeting hers. Thank you, Mrs. Ryan. I won't be any trouble. That had been 4 hours ago. She hadn't heard a sound from the room since. Not a footstep, not the creak of the bed, nothing. If not for the strange awareness prickling at the base of her neck, she might have believed he'd vanished altogether. Margaret busied herself in the kitchen, chopping vegetables with more concentration than soup required. The knife struck the cutting board in rhythmic thwacks that matched her heartbeat. What had possessed her to agree to this? A strange man in her home, homeless no less. Richard would have called it one of her bleeding heart decisions. He'd loved that about her once, before life hardened them both into practical people who measured even kindness by its cost. The floor creaked behind her. Margaret startled, the knife slipping and nearly catching her finger. "Sorry," James said, freezing in the doorway. "I didn't mean to frighten you." Margaret pressed a hand to her chest. "It's fine. I was just lost in thought." He nodded, understanding too quickly. His gaze swept the kitchen, taking in the 2 place settings she'd automatically arranged on the table. Something like sorrow flickered across his weathered face. "I can eat in my room if you prefer," he offered. "Don't be silly." Margaret turned back to her chopping. "It's just soup and bread. Nothing fancy." A silence stretched between them, filled with the soft sounds of cooking. The bubbling pot, the slide of the knife, her own carefully controlled breathing. She could feel him watching her, and wondered if he felt the same inexplicable familiarity she did, the sense of déjà vu that had settled over her since he arrived. "Can I help?" he finally asked. Margaret hesitated. "You could slice the bread if you like." He moved to the counter with surprising grace for a man his size. His hands, she noticed, were clean but rough, with a map of old scars across the knuckles. Teachers' hands shouldn't look like that, she thought. "Have you been in Millfield long?" she asked, reaching for the small talk she'd use with any stranger. "About 6 months." He focused intently on the bread knife, slicing with careful precision. "It's a nice town." "And before that?" His shoulders tensed slightly. "Here and there. Moved around a lot after I lost my teaching position." Margaret nodded, not pressing. Everyone had stories they kept folded away like old photographs. She respected the edges of his. They worked in silence until dinner was ready. Margaret ladled soup into bowls, her mother's autumn vegetable recipe, the one comfort she still allowed herself as the nights grew longer. James waited until she sat before taking his own seat, a courtesy that seemed at odds with the picture Pastor Bill had painted. "This is very kind of you," he said after the first spoonful. "It's been a long time since I've had homemade soup." "It's nothing special." Margaret tore a piece of bread, avoiding his gaze. "Just my mother's recipe. Celery, carrots, tomatoes, and—" He paused, his spoon halfway to his mouth. "Thyme? But there's something else." Margaret stared at him. "A bay leaf. And a splash of sherry. My mother always said it was the secret ingredient." James nodded slowly, his eyes distant. "My mother used to say the same thing." The coincidence hung between them, oddly heavy. Margaret watched as he ate methodically, savoring each spoonful as if committing it to memory. There was something in his mannerisms, the way he held his spoon, the careful way he broke his bread, that tugged at her memory like an insistent child. "Were you always a teacher?" she asked, wanting suddenly to redirect her thoughts. His expression softened. "8th grade English for almost 20 years. I loved it. What happened? If you don't mind my asking." James set down his spoon, and for a moment, Margaret regretted her question. His face seemed to collapse inward, revealing the architecture of old pain. "Life," he said simply. "Mistakes. One bad decision that led to another until—" He gestured vaguely at himself, encompassing everything from his worn clothes to his presence at her table. Margaret nodded, understanding more than she wanted to. One bad decision. Wasn't that what had torn her own family apart? One moment of anger, harsh words that could never be taken back, and 37 years of silence stretching between then and now. "We all have regrets," she said quietly. James looked up at her then, really looked, and Margaret felt something crack inside her chest, a hairline fracture in the carefully constructed wall she'd built around her memories. "Yes," he agreed, his voice rough. "Some heavier than others. After dinner, he insisted on washing the dishes. Margaret watched from the doorway as his large hands moved carefully between sink and drying rack, handling her dishes with the same attention he might give to fragile manuscripts. When he lifted her mother's soup tureen to the upper cabinet, reaching the high shelf without the step stool she always needed, she felt a wave of gratitude so unexpected it nearly brought tears to her eyes. "Thank you," she said when he finished. "I usually spend an hour reading before bed. There are books in the living room if you'd like one. I haven't read much lately. Hard to carry books when you're—" He trailed off, the unspoken word homeless hovering between them. "What did you like to read? When you were teaching?" His face transformed, years falling away as enthusiasm lit his features. "American classics mostly. Steinbeck, Lee, but Shakespeare was my first love." Margaret smiled despite herself. "My brother loved Shakespeare too. He could recite whole passages from memory." The words slipped out before she could catch them. She never spoke of Thomas. "Not to anyone." James's expression stilled into something unreadable. "You have a brother?" Margaret turned away, busying herself with wiping an already clean counter. "We lost touch many years ago. I'm sorry." The simple words carried such genuine regret that Margaret looked back at him. In the dim kitchen light, with shadows softening his face, he looked younger, more vulnerable. "It was a lifetime ago," she said, the practiced dismissal automatic on her lips. He nodded, accepting the closed door in her response. "I think I'll turn in early if that's all right. It's been a day of changes." "Of course." "Good night, Mr. Sullivan." "James," he corrected gently. "Please," she nodded, watching as he moved toward the hallway. At the doorway, he paused, looking back with an expression so full of complicated emotion that Margaret felt her breath catch. "Mrs. Ryan?" "Margaret," she corrected, the exchange feeling strangely ceremonial. "Margaret," he repeated as if testing the sound. "Thank you. Not just for the room, but for—" He gestured to the kitchen, the remains of their shared meal, the simple dignity of sitting at a table instead of accepting charity standing up. After he disappeared down the hall, Margaret stood in the kitchen, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of another person moving through her home. The faint creak of floorboards, water running in the bathroom, the soft click of the guest room door. She made her way to the living room, picked up her book, but the words swam before her eyes. Instead, she found herself retrieving her old photo album from the bottom shelf, the one she kept but never opened. The pictures inside were frozen moments from another life. Margaret as a young woman, her hair still fully brown, laughing on a porch swing, Richard in his Air Force uniform, their wedding day, and further back, childhood snapshots. Margaret at 10, gap-toothed and grinning, at 16, serious in her graduation gown, and Thomas. Her little brother, 3 years younger, always following her like a shadow. Thomas building snow forts. Thomas with a fishing rod too big for his small frame. Thomas at his high school graduation, lanky and proud in his cap and gown, their parents beaming beside him. The pictures stopped there. No college graduation, no wedding, no holidays or family gatherings spanning the next 3 decades. The last photo in the album was one Margaret had almost forgotten. She and Thomas on the old backyard tire swing their father had built, both laughing so hard they looked as if they might fall off. She was 17, he was 14, summer before she left for college, before the arguments began, before their parents' health declined, before Thomas started making what their father called wrong choices, before the final fight that sent him walking out the door, their father's ultimatum ringing in the air, and Margaret's failure to stand up for him burning like acid in her throat. "I didn't know what to do," she whispered to the laughing boy in the photograph. "I was scared too." 37 years of regret. 37 years of wondering where he went, if he was safe, if he was even alive. Searches that grew less frequent as decades passed. Hope that dimmed but never quite died. Margaret closed the album and pressed it to her chest. In the quiet house with a stranger sleeping under her roof, the weight of absence felt suddenly acutely present. Morning came with pale sunlight and the disorienting moment when Margaret remembered she wasn't alone. She dressed carefully, something she hadn't bothered with since Richard died, and made her way to the kitchen, half expecting to find it empty. Instead, James stood at the stove, spatula in hand, making what smelled like French toast. "Good morning," he said, glancing up with a hesitant smile. "I hope you don't mind. I wanted to thank you for yesterday." Margaret blinked at the domestic scene, so unexpected it seemed almost comical. "You didn't have to do that." I wanted to. He flipped a piece of bread in the pan. It's been a long time since I had a kitchen to cook in. I've missed it. Where did you learn to cook? She moved to the coffee maker, needing the familiar ritual to ground herself. A shadow crossed his face. My sister taught me the basics long ago. Said every man should know how to feed himself. Margaret's hand stilled on the coffee canister. You have a sister? Had, he echoed her words from last night. We lost touch. The parallel hung between them, strange and uncomfortable. Margaret busied herself with measuring coffee grounds, trying to ignore the prickle of awareness along her spine, the sense that something important hovered just beyond her understanding. James served the French toast on her everyday plates, arranging them with a care that spoke of remembered dignity. They ate in a silence that gradually softened from awkward to companionable. I should go to the church today, James said as they cleared the table. Pastor Bill wants me to fill out some housing forms, and I help sort donations on Fridays. I'll drive you. Margaret offered immediately, surprising herself. I need to pick up some groceries anyway. His face registered gratitude mingled with something like embarrassment. You don't have to go out of your way. It's no trouble. Millfield's small enough that everything's on the way to everything else. An hour later, Margaret found herself driving the familiar streets with an unfamiliar passenger. James sat perfectly still beside her, hands folded in his lap, gaze fixed on the passing scenery. His stillness wasn't peaceful but practiced, the careful self-containment of someone who had learned to make himself invisible. How long have you lived here? He asked suddenly. In Millfield? Since I married Richard. 40 years this past June. She navigated the turn toward First Methodist. We moved into the house after his parents passed. Family home. And before that, I grew up in Lakeside. Small town about 60 miles north of here. She tapped her fingers against the steering wheel, memories surfacing like bubbles in still water. Nothing special. Left for college and never really went back, except to visit my parents before they passed. James nodded, still looking out the window. Looks like a nice place to raise a family. Margaret corrected herself, thinking of Claire, now raising her own children a world away. My daughter lives in Australia now, with her husband and the grandchildren. You must miss them. The simple observation, spoken without judgment, loosened something in Margaret's chest. Every day. Video calls aren't the same. No, James agreed softly. They're not. She pulled into the church parking lot, stopping near the side entrance where the outreach center operated. James made no move to get out immediately, his hand resting on the door handle as if gathering courage. Thank you for the ride, he finally said, turning to face her. And for breakfast. And for... He gestured vaguely. It's nothing, Margaret said, uncomfortable with his gratitude. It's everything, he corrected, voice suddenly fierce. To be seen as a person, not a problem. You don't know what that means. The intensity in his voice made her look at him, really look, and for a disorienting moment, she saw past the beard and the weathered skin to something achingly familiar in the set of his jaw, the furrow between his brows. I'll pick you up at noon, she said, looking away quickly. Just text me when you're ready. His quiet laugh held no humor. No phone, but I'll be waiting out front at 12. As she watched him walk away, shoulders hunched against the crisp morning air, Margaret felt a strange hollowness open inside her. She sat in the parking lot long after he'd disappeared inside, trying to understand why helping this stranger felt so different from the other charity work she'd done over the years. Different and dangerously close to necessary. The grocery store was busy with Friday shoppers. Margaret pushed her cart down familiar aisles, adding items to her usual list almost without thinking. Coffee, the good kind, not her usual store brand. Honey for tea. Extra bread. Apples, because this morning she'd noticed James eyeing the nearly empty fruit bowl. Margaret Ryan, is that you? She turned to find Evelyn Porter, the town's most dedicated gossip, bearing down on her with a cart full of sale items and an expression of barely contained curiosity. Hello, Evelyn. How are you? Just fine, dear. But what's this I hear about you taking in one of the homeless men from the church program? Pastor Bill's wife mentioned it at book club last night. Margaret stiffened. Small towns. Nothing stayed private for long. It's temporary. He needed a place to stay until his housing comes through. Evelyn's eyes widened. In your house? Alone with you? Margaret, have you thought this through? After what happened to Dottie Simmons when she let that handyman stay in her garage apartment, James is nothing like that? Margaret interrupted, surprising herself with the vehemence in her voice. He's a former teacher who fell on hard times. That's what they all say, dear. Evelyn leaned closer, lowering her voice to a stage whisper. You should at least let Frank Barnes from the police department run a background check. Richard would want you to be safe. The mention of her late husband, wielded like a weapon, made Margaret's cheeks burn. I appreciate your concern, Evelyn, but I'm perfectly capable of making my own decisions. She steered her cart away, heart pounding. The encounter left a sour taste in her mouth, but underneath the annoyance lurked an uncomfortable question. What did she really know about James Sullivan? By the time she pulled up to the church at noon, the question had grown thorns. James was waiting as promised, a plastic bag clutched in one hand. He smiled when he saw her, a gentle expression that transformed his face. How did it go? She asked as he settled into the passenger seat. Good. Forms are filed. He lifted the bag. And I found something at the donation center I thought you might like. A thank you gift. You didn't need to... Please. His voice softened. Let me have this small dignity. Margaret nodded, throat suddenly tight. He passed her the bag, and she reached inside to find a paperback copy of Pride and Prejudice, its cover worn but beautiful. You mentioned last night that you like to read before bed, James explained. I noticed you had mostly mysteries on your shelf, but everyone should have at least one Austen. The thoughtfulness of the gesture, so unexpected, made Margaret's eyes sting. This is very kind. Thank you. It's nothing compared to what you've done for me. As they drove home, Margaret found herself stealing glances at the man beside her. His profile in the autumn sunlight looked softer, less ravaged by whatever hardships had brought him to her door. The question of who he really was still prickled at the back of her mind, but it felt less urgent now, tempered by the book resting in her lap, proof that kindness could flow both ways, even between strangers. Or perhaps especially between strangers who had nothing between them but the choice to be kind. The days fell into a rhythm neither of them acknowledged building. James cooked breakfast. Margaret made dinner. They shared the cleaning without discussion, a choreography of domestic tasks that felt both foreign and familiar. In the evenings, they read in companionable silence in the living room, Margaret working her way through Pride and Prejudice, James absorbed in a volume of Steinbeck he'd found on her bookshelf. Margaret learned that James took his coffee black, but his tea with honey. That he hummed under his breath when he thought no one was listening, old folk songs her father had loved. That his hands, despite their roughness, handled her mother's delicate teacups with extraordinary care. Little pieces of his story emerged in fragments, teaching positions in 3 different states. A marriage that had ended 20 years ago. No children. A sister he spoke of rarely, but with a pain that made Margaret's heart ache in recognition. On the 5th day, she came home from volunteering at the library to find him in the backyard, raking leaves that had fallen from the giant maple. She watched through the kitchen window as he worked methodically, the same careful attention he gave to everything. When he finished, he stood looking up into the branches for a long moment, expression unreadable in the golden afternoon light. That night at dinner, she asked the question that had been hovering between them. What happened to you, James? How does someone go from teaching English to... She gestured vaguely, not wanting to say the word homeless aloud. He set down his fork, expression shuddering. For a moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. It wasn't one thing, he finally said. It was many small things and then one big thing. He looked down at his plate. I lost my job after budget cuts. Couldn't find another. Too old, too expensive to hire. The divorce had left me with debts. I sold my house to pay them, moved to a small apartment. Then I got sick, pneumonia. No insurance by then? Hospital bills. Each sentence emerged like it was being pulled from somewhere deep and painful. I started living in my car. Sold it when the registration expired. Worked odd jobs, stayed in shelters when I could. Kept moving because staying in one place meant facing how far I'd fallen. Margaret's throat felt tight. And your family? Your sister? A shadow crossed his face. We hadn't spoken in many years. My fault, not hers. Pride is a terrible thing, Margaret. It makes you think you can walk back through doors you've slammed shut whenever you're ready. He gave a brittle laugh. By the time I was ready, I had no way to find her. No way to say I was sorry. The raw honesty in his voice made Margaret's eyes burn. I'm sure she would forgive you if she knew. James looked up, his gaze so intense she had to resist the urge to look away. Would you forgive your brother after all this time? The question hit her like a physical blow. She stopped, realizing she'd never really asked herself that. Would she forgive Thomas if he appeared on her doorstep tomorrow, after 37 years of silence? I don't know. An honest answer. he said softly. Later, after they'd cleared the dishes and retreated to their evening reading, Margaret found herself watching James over the top of her book. There was something about the way he held himself, the particular angle of his head as he concentrated, that nagged at her memory like a splinter under skin. "Would you read something aloud?" she asked suddenly. "I miss hearing Shakespeare." He looked up, startled, then pleased. "Any particular play?" "Your favorite." A smile touched his lips. "The Tempest, always." Margaret's heart gave a peculiar lurch. Thomas's favorite had been The Tempest. A coincidence, surely. But as James began to recite from memory, "Our revels now are ended. These our actors, as I foretold you, were all spirits and are melted into air, into thin air." She felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn evening. His voice transformed as he spoke the familiar lines, becoming richer, more confident. The words flowed with a rhythm that spoke of long familiarity, of love worn smooth like a river stone. Margaret found herself transported not by the poetry itself, but by the eerie sense of déjà vu, of having heard these words in almost this voice long ago. When he finished, the silence between them felt charged with something neither of them was ready to name. "That was beautiful," she finally said. "You must have been a wonderful teacher." "I tried to be." His smile held a shadow of old grief. "Shakespeare speaks to the lost ones, the ones who feel they don't belong. That's why I taught him to 8th graders, the age when everyone feels cast away on some strange island." Margaret nodded, thinking of her own classroom from decades ago, the nervous young teacher she'd been. "I taught elementary school before Claire was born." "2nd grade. You never went back?" "No. Richard's job kept us moving for many years. By the time we settled here, Claire was in middle school and..." She shrugged. "Life takes the turns it takes." James closed his book, his expression thoughtful. "May I ask you something personal?" Margaret tensed but nodded. "Your brother? You said you lost touch. What happened?" The question hung in the air between them, heavier than it should have been between two people who'd known each other less than a week. Margaret set her book aside, buying time to gather words she'd never spoken aloud. "We had a fight." "Well, he had a fight with our father and I..." She swallowed hard. "I didn't stand up for him when I should have. He left, never came back." "What was the fight about?" Margaret stared into the middle distance, seeing not her living room but the kitchen of her childhood home, the slam of the screen door still echoing in her memory. "Thomas wanted to be a writer. Our father wanted him to take over the family business, hardware store. Practical, secure." She twisted her hands in her lap. There were awful things said, accusations. Thomas had been struggling, making what my father called poor choices, friends our parents didn't approve of, drinking, talk of dropping out of college. The memories rose like dark water, threatening to drown her. That last night, Father gave him an ultimatum: straighten up and follow the path laid out for him, or leave with nothing. No support, no family, no... Her voice broke. "No sister who was brave enough to speak up. You were young," James said softly. "I was a coward," Margaret corrected. "I watched my little brother walk out that door with nothing but the clothes on his back, and I did nothing to stop it. And then," she pressed a hand to her mouth, forcing back the sob that threatened, "and then I spent 37 years wondering if he was alive or dead, if he ever knew how sorry I was, if he ever forgave me." The confession left her trembling. She hadn't meant to say so much, to lay bare the central wound of her life to a man who was still, despite the growing ease between them, essentially a stranger. James sat very still, his expression hidden in the shadows cast by the reading lamp. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. "I think he would forgive you if he knew. I think perhaps he's spent just as many years regretting his own pride." Something in his tone made Margaret look up sharply. "You can't know that." "No," he agreed too quickly. "Just a feeling." The air between them felt suddenly charged, as if they stood on the edge of a precipice neither was ready to acknowledge. Margaret rose abruptly, needing space to breathe. "It's getting late. I think I'll turn in." James nodded, accepting the retreat. "Good night, Margaret." In her bedroom, Margaret sat on the edge of her bed for a long time, heart pounding as if she'd run a great distance. The conversation replayed in her mind, along with a montage of small details she'd been collecting without realizing it. James's blue eyes, the same shade as her own. The way he reached for the high shelf without thinking. His love of Shakespeare, specifically The Tempest. The familiar cadence of his voice when reciting lines she'd heard somewhere before. Could it be? After all these years? She shook her head, dismissing the thought as wishful thinking. grief and loneliness playing tricks on her heart. Thomas would be 59 now. This man might be around that age, but the resemblance ended there. Her brother had been slim, quick to laugh, with a musician's hands. Not this weathered, solemn man with work-roughened palms. And yet, Margaret opened her nightstand drawer and removed the photograph she kept there, the last one taken of Thomas, his high school graduation. She studied the young face, trying to project decades of hardship onto it, trying to see if James could possibly be hiding beneath the years. The exercise felt both foolish and painful. She returned the photo to the drawer and turned out the light, determined to put such fanciful thoughts aside. But in the darkness, as sleep eluded her, the question persisted. What if the brother she'd lost had somehow found his way back to her in the strangest way imaginable? What if he had been testing her all this time, seeing if the sister who had failed him once would fail him again by turning away a stranger in need? Morning dawned gray and drizzling, matching Margaret's mood after a night of fractured sleep and circular thoughts. She found James already in the kitchen, a cup of coffee waiting for her on the table. "You look tired," he said, concern evident in his voice. "Did you sleep poorly?" Margaret wrapped her hands around the warm mug, avoiding his gaze. "Just one of those nights." They moved through their breakfast routine in silence that felt different from the comfortable quiet of previous days. Margaret could feel James watching her, a question in his eyes that he didn't voice. As they cleared the dishes, the doorbell rang. Margaret frowned. She wasn't expecting anyone this early. "I'll get it," James offered, but Margaret shook her head. "Better if I do. Small towns, you know. People talk." She opened the door to find Pastor Bill on her porch, rain beating on his jacket, expression troubled. "Margaret, good morning. I hope I'm not interrupting." "Not at all, Pastor. Would you like to come in?" He stepped inside, removing his wet hat. "Actually, I need to speak with James." "Is he available?" "Of course. He's in the kitchen." "Is everything all right?" Pastor Bill's expression tightened. "I'm afraid there's been a complication with his housing application." Margaret led him to the kitchen, where James stood by the sink, dish towel still in hand. His face closed when he saw Pastor Bill's expression. "What's happened?" he asked without preamble. Pastor Bill looked uncomfortable. "The county housing office ran their standard background check and, well, there seems to be a discrepancy with your identification." James went very still. "What kind of discrepancy? The social security number you provided?" Pastor Bill glanced at Margaret, clearly reluctant to continue in her presence. "It's all right," James said quietly. "Margaret can hear whatever you have to say." Pastor Bill nodded. "The number doesn't match the name James Sullivan. It belongs to someone named Thomas Ryan." The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. She grabbed the back of a chair to steady herself, the room suddenly spinning around her. "Thomas Ryan," she repeated, her voice sounding distant to her own ears. James, or Thomas, closed his eyes briefly, a spasm of pain crossing his face. When he opened them again, he looked directly at Margaret for what felt like the first time. "I'm sorry," he said simply. "I didn't know how to tell you." The confirmation she'd both feared and hoped for left her speechless. Her little brother, standing in her kitchen, having slept under her roof for a week without revealing himself. The magnitude of the deception made her knees weak. Pastor Bill looked between them, confusion evident. "Do you two know each other?" "He's my brother," Margaret said, the words coming out flat and strange. "My brother who disappeared 37 years ago." Understanding dawned on Pastor Bill's face, followed quickly by concern. "I see. Perhaps I should leave you two to talk." Neither Margaret nor Thomas responded, locked in a gaze that contained decades of absence. Pastor Bill cleared his throat awkwardly. "I'll see myself out. James, Thomas, we can discuss the housing situation later." The sound of the front door closing barely registered. Margaret stared at the stranger who wasn't, trying to find her little brother in the weathered face before her. "Why?" she finally asked, the single word containing a universe of hurt. Thomas's shoulders slumped. "I didn't plan it. When Pastor Bill said the name Ryan, I thought it might be coincidence. Millfield isn't that far from Lakeside. But then I saw you and I knew. And you said nothing." The betrayal cut deep, reopening wounds she'd thought long scarred over. "You let me take you in, feed you, share my home, all while knowing who you were to me. I was afraid." His voice broke on the admission. "Afraid you'd turn me away if you knew. That you'd still be angry. That I'd see in your face that you never wanted to see me again. So you lied instead?" Margaret's voice rose. "Let me pour my heart out to you about my missing brother while you sat there pretending to be a stranger." Thomas flinched. I was going to tell you. I just needed to find the right moment to be sure. To be sure of what? That I was worthy of knowing the truth? The anger felt good, a clean burn after decades of self-recrimination. Or were you punishing me? Watching me squirm with guilt over what happened, enjoying my confession? No! Thomas stepped toward her, then stopped when she backed away. God, no, Margaret. I was ashamed. Look at me. He gestured at himself, at the second-hand clothes, the years of hardship etched into his face. I left home promising to prove Father wrong, to make something of myself. And instead, I've ended up exactly where he predicted, a failure dependent on charity. The raw pain in his voice cut through Margaret's anger, leaving her hollow. She sank into a chair, suddenly exhausted. 37 years, Thomas. Not one word to let me know you were alive. He remained standing, hands hanging helplessly at his sides. The longer I stayed away, the harder it became to reach out. Pride, like I said last night. By the time I hit bottom, I was too ashamed to find you. And now? Margaret looked up at him, searching his face. Why come back now? I didn't mean to. Not like this. Thomas's voice was barely audible. But when I saw you on that porch, when you opened your door to me, it felt like the universe giving me one last chance to make things right. The kitchen clock ticked loudly in the silence that followed. Outside, the rain intensified, drumming against the windows. Margaret stared at her hands, at the age spots and fine lines that hadn't been there when Thomas knew her last. She thought of all the years between, the holidays with an empty chair, the milestones unmarked, the slow death of hope as decade followed decade with no word. And then she thought of the man who had cooked breakfast in her kitchen each morning, who had raked her leaves without being asked, who had given her a book because he'd noticed what she liked to read. Her brother, finding his way back to her in the strangest, most painful way possible. I have a photograph of you, she said finally. Your graduation picture. I've kept it all these years. Thomas made a soft, broken sound. I didn't think anyone would remember me. Remember you? Margaret's laugh held no humor. You've haunted this family like a ghost. Claire grew up hearing stories about the uncle she never met. I've looked for your face in every crowd since I was 25 years old. She stood abruptly, needing to move, to escape the suffocating weight of revelation. I need time. To think. To process this. Thomas nodded, his expression closing again. I understand. I'll get my things. Where will you go? He shrugged, the gesture so familiar it made her heart ache. Back to the shelter. Pastor Bill will figure something out. In this rain? With no transportation? The practical concerns provided safe ground, away from the emotional quicksand threatening to swallow them both. Don't be ridiculous. He looked at her, hope and wariness battling in his expression. You want me to stay? Margaret broke off, unsure how to articulate the storm of feelings inside her. I don't know what I want, but I know I don't want you walking 3 miles in the rain to sleep on a cot at the shelter. The compromise settled between them, uneasy but workable. Thomas nodded once, accepting the temporary reprieve. Thank you. Margaret turned away, unable to bear the gratitude in his eyes, gratitude from her brother for the most basic kindness. I'm going to lie down for a while. I didn't sleep well last night. She left him standing in the kitchen, surrounded by the domestic scene they'd created together without knowing its true significance. As she closed her bedroom door behind her, the tears she'd been holding back finally broke free, hot and silent. Her brother had come home. A miracle wrapped in deception, a reunion 37 years too late. What happened now was anyone's guess. The rain continued all day, turning the yard into a sodden canvas of fallen leaves and gray sky. Margaret remained in her room for hours, alternating between anger, shock, and a strange, tender grief for all the years they'd lost. When she finally emerged, she found Thomas. She couldn't think of him as James anymore, sitting at the kitchen table with an old photo album open before him. Her breath caught. It was the album she'd looked at that first night, the one containing the last pictures of them together. He looked up at the sound of her footsteps, his expression vulnerable and afraid in a way that made him suddenly, unmistakably recognizable as her little brother. I found this on the bookshelf, he said quietly. I hope you don't mind. Margaret approached slowly, feeling as if she were moving through a dream. She sat across from him, looking down at the page he had open, the tire swing photo, their last happy summer. I remember that day, Thomas said, his finger hovering just above the image, not quite touching it. Dad had just built the swing. You thought you were too grown up for it, but I talked you into trying it with me. You always could talk me into anything, Margaret said, the memory rising unbidden. Remember when you convinced me to help you borrow Mrs. Whitaker's rowboat? A ghost of a smile touched his lips. We were going to be explorers, discover new lands. We made it halfway across the lake before the storm hit. The shared memory created a fragile bridge between them. Mother was furious. Father was worse. That was the first time he called me irresponsible, a word I would hear many times after that. The smile faded. Margaret studied her brother's face, really seeing him now that she knew who he was. The years had been harsh, carving deep lines around his eyes and mouth, but his gaze was the same, thoughtful, intense, a little sad. What happened to you, Thomas? The real story. He closed the album gently, as if closing a door on the past. The truth isn't much different from what I told you. I was James Sullivan for so long, sometimes I forgot Thomas Ryan ever existed. Start at the beginning, Margaret said. After you left home. Thomas nodded, gathering himself. I went to Chicago first, worked odd jobs, finished college at night, did eventually get my teaching degree like I told you. Taught English for almost 20 years in various schools. And you married? The realization that her brother had had a whole life she knew nothing about made Margaret's chest ache. Briefly. Ellen, she was a music teacher. It didn't last. My fault, not hers. I was difficult to live with. Moody. Never quite at peace. He looked down at his hands. We divorced after 5 years. No children, thank God. I wouldn't have been a good father. The starkness of his self-assessment made Margaret wince. You don't know that. I do. His certainty was absolute. I carried too much anger from our father, too much resentment. It poisoned everything I touched for a long time. Margaret remembered the sullen teenager her brother had become in those last years at home, the fights that grew more frequent as he pushed against their father's rigid expectations. You weren't the only angry one. No, Thomas agreed. But I was the one who left. The simple statement hung between them, laden with meaning. Margaret reached across the table, almost touching his hand before drawing back. What happened to your teaching career? Thomas's expression darkened. Budget cuts at first. Then, I made a mistake. A student was being bullied, badly. I intervened more forcefully than I should have. Grabbed the bully's arm, left a bruise. His parents pressed charges. They were dropped, but the damage was done. No school would touch me after that. Oh, Thomas, don't pity me, he said sharply. I made my choices. Every step of the way. Margaret fell silent, recognizing the pride that had always been her brother's downfall, the same pride that had kept him from reaching out when things got bad. After that, Thomas continued after a moment, everything unraveled pretty much as I told you. Odd jobs, illness, debt, eventually homelessness. He gave a bitter laugh. I spent 2 winters on the streets of Indianapolis before I started moving south. Colder states are harder when you're sleeping rough. The casual way he spoke of such hardship made Margaret's throat tight. Her little brother, sleeping on the streets while she lived in her comfortable home, set 2 places at her table out of habit rather than hope. Why didn't you contact me? The question that had haunted her for decades finally emerged, sad rather than accusatory. Thomas met her gaze directly. At first it was anger, then pride, then shame, and finally, he sighed. Finally, it was love. What good would it do you to see what I'd become? Better to let you remember me as I was. That wasn't your decision to make, Margaret said, a flash of the old anger returning. You had no right to decide what would be best for me. No, he admitted. I didn't. Just one more mistake in a lifetime of them. The rain drummed against the windows, filling the silence between them. Margaret looked at her brother, really looked, and saw beneath the years of hardship to the boy she had known. The little brother who had followed her everywhere, who had read Shakespeare aloud in their treehouse, who had cried on her shoulder when their first dog died. I made mistakes too, she said quietly. I should have stood up to Father that night. I should have gone after you. Thomas shook his head. You were 25. You had your own life to build. You were my little brother. Margaret's voice broke on the words. I was supposed to protect you. The simple truth hung between them, 2 people who had failed each other in the most fundamental ways, meeting again as broken, older versions of themselves, but meeting nonetheless. What do we do now? Thomas asked, the question containing all the uncertainty of their situation. Margaret didn't have an answer. The shock of discovery was still too fresh, the years of absence too vast to bridge in a single conversation. But she knew one thing with absolute certainty. She would not lose her brother again. We start over, she said finally. Not as strangers, not as idealized memories, but as who we are now. Thomas nodded, a cautious hope flickering in his eyes. I'd like that. Outside, the rain began to ease, thin shafts of late afternoon sunlight breaking through the clouds. A new beginning, marked by nature itself. You'll stay here, Margaret said, the decision crystallizing as she spoke. Not for 2 weeks. For as long as you need to get back on your feet. Margaret, I have the space, she continued, not letting him argue. And ... She hesitated, then forced herself to speak the truth. And I've been alone too long. The admission cost her, but the look on Thomas's face, surprise giving way to tentative joy, was worth the price. Are you sure? He asked. Once the town finds out who I am, who I was, there will be talk. Margaret thought of Evelyn Porter and her warnings, of the gossip that would inevitably spread when people learned she'd taken in not just a homeless man, but her long-lost brother, and she found to her surprise that she didn't care. Let them talk, she said with a decisive nod. We've lost too many years to worry about what anyone else thinks. Thomas smiled then, a real smile that reached his eyes and transformed his face, making him suddenly, unmistakably recognizable as the brother she'd lost. I've missed you, Maggie, he said, using the childhood nickname no one had called her in decades. The sound of it unlocked something final in Margaret's heart. She rose from her chair and circled the table, opening her arms to the brother who stood to meet her. I've missed you too, Tommy, she whispered as they embraced for the first time in 37 years. Welcome home. The news spread through Millfield like wildfire, as small-town news inevitably does. By the end of the week, everyone knew that Margaret Ryan's homeless guest was actually her long-lost brother, returned after nearly 4 decades. Some, like Evelyn Porter, called it suspicious, a convenient story, a potential con. Others found it romantic, like something from a movie. Pastor Bill, who had unwittingly orchestrated the reunion, called it divine providence. Margaret and Thomas called it a second chance. Autumn deepened around them as they began the slow, careful work of becoming family again. There were hard conversations about their father's passing, about the years Thomas had lost with their mother, about Claire and the niece and nephews he had never met. There were moments when the weight of absence threatened to crush them both, when the reality of all they'd missed felt too vast to bear. But there were good moments too. Thomas helping Margaret clean out the garage, uncovering boxes of childhood memorabilia they explored together like archaeologists of their shared past. Margaret teaching Thomas to use video calling, arranging a tearful introduction to Claire in Australia, who cried at the sight of the uncle she'd known only through stories. The night they stayed up until dawn, sharing the missing chapters of their lives, filling in the decades-long gap between who they had been and who they had become. November brought the first frost, silvering the lawn and etching delicate patterns on the windows. Margaret woke early, wrapped herself in a robe, and made her way to the kitchen, where she found Thomas already awake, 2 mugs of coffee steaming on the table. Couldn't sleep? She asked, taking the seat across from him. He shook his head. Good thoughts keeping me awake for once. Margaret smiled, understanding. The nightmares that had plagued him in those first weeks, the ones that sometimes sent him wandering the house at midnight, afraid to close his eyes, had begun to ease. Claire called last night after you went to bed, she said, warming her hands around the mug. She and the family are coming for Christmas. She wants the kids to meet their great-uncle in person. Thomas's face lit with a joy that still surprised her with its intensity. Really? He stopped, emotion overwhelming him. That's wonderful. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun rise over the frost-covered yard. So much had changed in the 2 months since Thomas arrived on her doorstep. His beard was neatly trimmed now, his clothes no longer donated church items but purchases they'd made together. The local community college had offered him a part-time position teaching adult literacy classes, a small step back toward the career he'd loved. And Margaret had changed too. The house that had felt too empty now felt just right. The habit of setting 2 places at the table was no longer a widow's ritual, but a celebration of reunion. She sang in the shower again, volunteered more at the library, and had started talking about possibly traveling to Australia with Thomas next summer. Do you ever wonder, Thomas asked suddenly, breaking the comfortable silence, if I hadn't ended up here, if Pastor Bill hadn't brought me to your door, how many more years might have passed? Margaret considered the question, the many twists of fate that had brought them back together. I like to think we would have found each other eventually, that some part of you was always working your way back home. Thomas reached across the table, taking her hand in his. His fingers were warmer now, no longer the perpetually cold hands of a man who had spent too many nights without shelter. "I was," he said simply, "even when I didn't know it." Through the window, they could see a cardinal landing on the maple tree's bare branches, a spot of brilliant red against the winter-gray morning. A reminder that even in the coldest seasons, life persists, color returns, hope endures. Margaret squeezed her brother's hand, feeling the miracle of his presence anew. "We lost so many years," she said softly. "But not all of them," Thomas answered. "Not the ones that matter most." Together they watched the sun climb higher, transforming the frost into drops of light across the lawn. The future stretched before them, no longer a lonely road, but a path they would walk together, two people who had found each other again in the most unexpected way, proving that sometimes the longest journeys lead us exactly where we need to be, home.